What if the biggest obstacle to better leadership isn't a lack of strategy, but a lack of emotional fluency? In today's episode, we're diving into the heart of communication with Clarice Belcher, a facilitator and teacher of Marshall Rosenberg's transformational work in nonviolent communication, what she calls the language of compassion. Clarice believes that most workplace problems, disengagement, resistance, burnout, aren't strategy failures. They're unmet needs hiding beneath the surface. In a world that tells us leave our feelings at the door, Clarice is here to remind us feelings aren't the problem, they are the pathway. And if you're a leader who wants to build trust, retain talent, and create a culture where people want to show up and contribute, this conversation will challenge you in the way you think about communication, leadership, and how we bring humanity back to business. So Clarice, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Lisa. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm tempted to say, well, our show is done. That was a beautiful summary of the work that Marshall has done.
We have got a lot more to dig into, and I'm very excited about this because there's a lot of conversations in the world right now. And if we look at them, some of them aren't going so well. So I know you're going to set us up and equip us to maybe think differently about that.
Well, it is very interesting. Marshall was a 20th century psychologist, although he passed in February 2015. And he studied under Carl Rogers, who was among the first of the humanitarian psychologists. And it was there that Marshall learned about feelings and the importance of feelings. And then later, as he continued his study, he also began to see that needs were equally important. In fact, as Marshall saw it, they were more important. And so the value of feelings is it helps me know if my needs are being met or not met. But feelings actually are 10% of my connection to myself. Needs are 90%. And so if I feel frustrated or upset, it's not because someone is wrong or bad, it's because I have an unmet need. And rather than go into judgment and blame, which is a place that most people go because we've been trained and educated and enculturated to do that, he said, get curious, what's the need? What's the need? So to the extent that we are clear what our needs are, then we increase our chances for getting them met. If I have, example, a need to be heard and I say nothing about that, then how can I get my need to be heard met? And then I get frustrated or resentful. And that's going to show up in passive aggressive ways. And I don't even know that that's what's going on, except that I have this sort of vague feeling. So to be able to name feelings specifically and to be able to name needs specifically is so important in terms of devising the strategy. And most people, again, have been trained and educated and enculturated to think strategy. What are we going to do? We got to do something here. Whether it's in the business or family or colleagues, it's all the same. So Marshall believed needs first, then strategy. So if I'm in a business setting and I'm working with a client, well, what are the needs clients? And ask the needs, discover what they are, because that will increase chances for the needs of the client being met and give me direction for the strategies of having that happen.
Interesting. So when you started studying under Marshall Rosenberg, under these principles, like what was it that really sparked you to, because this has become your life's work, Clarice. What was it that made you go from whatever you were doing to say, this is the thing that is so important? I'm going to dedicate most of my life here to doing this.
Well, interestingly, I discovered his work while attending church many years ago. And the congregation of that church was in such deep conflict, it literally polarized the congregation. The minister and his staff did not have the skills for managing, so they brought in outside help. And I was curious what the outside help had to say. And I'll never forget the facilitator holding up Marshall's book. This is an older copy of Nonviolent Communication that Marshall wrote. And he said, learn it and memorize it. And I had never had an endorsement like that for a book before. And so I got curious. I did buy the book. I did read it. I can't say that I've memorized it, but I loved it. And then as it turned out, I thought, I'd love to meet this man. And 2 years later, he came to Atlanta, where I live, and he offered a 5-day workshop. And I attended 3 of those 5 days. And then he came 2 years later and offered a 10-day international intensive. And I realized I had been waiting for Marshall all my life. The way he thought about communication, the way he saw feelings, needs, and strategies was so clear and so specific that I was like, this is it for me. And I'm the one in his workshops going, yes, yes, yes to everything he said. But there were others going, yes, but. So there's a readiness for this work. And I was completely ready. And I so appreciate the way he thinks about communication because it offers the kind of connection that he believed was one of the foundations of the work, as well as contributing to the well-being of all. So those were the 2 fundamental purposes. So isn't that interesting? If we have 5 people at a table in conflict, well, the question isn't, well, which one gets their needs met? The question is, how do we meet the needs of all 5? And so that means slowing the process down, being really curious, well, what do people feel? What are their needs? And then addressing that. And what's interesting is that often the strategies arise organically from the expressed needs.
Very interesting. And I think it's so fascinating. Like you found this through a faith-based organization, right? So you're in this faith-based organization that when we look at it, it's to help us our spiritual development, to love each other, all of the things that, that stands for. And even in that, people have situations where they had to bring in someone to address this. But what I think, and I love that you talked about here, is this inner knowing, this connection. You immediately got drawn to it, right? And that's one thing I want to point out. When you look at the title of this show, your passion, purpose, and personal brand, there are things we are naturally wired and drawn to as a result of who we are and our experiences. So I want to applaud you, Clarice, for like even getting interested, getting curious, and pursuing that, because look at what it has opened up for your life.
That's very true. And I'm very grateful for it. I feel very grateful for it because it meets my need for meaning and purpose.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
Also contributing to the well-being of everyone. So,
which is part of the purpose that comes through. So you introduced this idea of feelings and needs and strategies. And you even brought a little bit into business. And then we're going to talk a lot more about how this fits into the business world because, it is a foreign thing. We say, leave your feelings at the door. So if we could unpack and what you've already referenced, it almost seems like there is a layer of feelings and then needs and strategies, but I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'll let you explain. How would you explain the difference to someone who is just encountering this for the first time?
Well, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate the question. Let's assume that we have a group of people in a meeting, and one of the members is talking and talking and talking and talking, and no one says anything. But they're going to have feelings around that. They might feel frustrated. They might feel angry. They might feel impatient. So connecting to those feelings is helpful because I can know in that moment I have an unmet need. Mm-hmm. So what would my need be? Well, it might be a need for clarity.
Mm-hmm.
I have to need for understanding or a need for ease, that it's hard for me to listen to someone speak 15 minutes long and not be able to ask a question. So if we could be honest with one another, and say, I'm aware of feeling frustrated, have a need for ease, would you be willing perhaps to condense some of what you're saying in 2 or 3 sentences, a summary, so that I can stay with you? That's a whole different experience from, okay, when is he going to stop talking? I'm bored here, and then be angry later and not really be able to contribute to what the team wants to do. That's just one example.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I'm thinking, if someone says, I'm having a hard time keeping up with you, it might be the language that they're using might be complicated terminology, or they don't see context or things like that. That really would, if you think about that one person experiencing it, may not be the only one who's thinking that, right?
Often that person is a voice for others in the group, but if no one is willing to speak up, then that behavior continues and continues and continues. And so it's interesting. It takes great courage, actually, to be vulnerable, to share what is I'm feeling and needing. But here's the beautiful piece of it. When I share what I'm feeling and needing, I'm sharing my experience. So I'm not judging someone or blaming someone and making them wrong, i.e., you talk too long, you talk too much. It's not about that. It's about my connecting to what's alive in me and sharing that in a way that increases my chances for being heard in the way I want to be heard.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me of a communication style, and this, I don't know if this is even what similar. When people hear something and you use I feel statements. Are those I feel statements? Is this what we're talking about here, Clarice?
It is part of it. So there are really 4 pieces to Marshall's work. In fact, if you want, I can share that on the screen. Shall I do that?
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can find, there it is. So these are 4 components. The first, observe without evaluation. The second, share feelings. The third, state needs. And then the fourth, request a specific response. And all of this material comes from Marshall's book, Nonviolent Communication. So notice I tried to do icons to give a visual for each of these. And in this first icon, there's no mouth in this person's face. That wasn't by accident, that was deliberate. Because if I decide to observe without evaluation, then whatever judgments or evaluation I have in my mind of someone else, I keep in my mind. So what I observe first is the behavior. So it might say, so when I'm aware that the discussion has lasted 15 minutes, that's all I'm doing is giving a context. And then I would come immediately back to share my feelings. I feel frustrated or I feel unsettled. And then I would come back and share my needs because I have a need for ease. And then I might make a specific request. And Marshall believed the best way to preface a specific request were the words, would you be willing to? Would you be willing to speak more slowly? Or would you be willing to summarize in 2 sentences what's important? And this is the beauty of the work because it's not making someone wrong. It's not making someone bad. It's helping them know their impact on me, how I am experiencing it in the moment.
All right, that's good. I can see where like already barriers would be starting to break down and a new way of communicating is coming forth. But Clarice, why do you believe so many people, and a lot of my listeners are professionals, all right? Why do so many professionals struggle to identify or express their true needs? And what is it that, we're not supposed to be talking about that in the workplace?
I really appreciate that question. The answer I offer is that I suspect 95% of us have been trained and educated and enculturated to stay as far away from feelings and needs as we can, especially as children. I grew up, children are to be seen, not heard. It didn't matter how I felt about something. It was just do it. And that's the kind of culture I think that we have as Americans is just do it. And if we don't connect first to our feelings and needs, then there are going to be feelings and needs present. But if they never get addressed, then I think that's what accounts for a lot of behavior that doesn't contribute to the well-being of people's lives. And so I think that's especially true of men. Marshall writes in his book when he was young, maybe elementary school or middle school, he was in tears. And his teacher, who interestingly was a woman, said to him, big boys don't cry. So what do you make of that if you're young? You learn it's not safe to cry. It's not safe to have feelings. And Marshall noted, interestingly, that as a psychologist, and he's going to deal with clients' feelings occasionally, at no point was he ever asked how he felt.
Mm-hmm.
So even in the field of psychology, that's improving. I will say that. It is improving. More and more therapists are beginning to be curious about feelings and to explore them with clients. But if feelings are 10% of our connection to ourselves and needs are 90, then it's important to be aware of what our needs are.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to share something else, if I might.
Absolutely.
Just show that connection, because sometimes I think people think, feelings are over here and needs are over here and never shall the twain meet, so to speak. But here's something that I wanted to share that might help to show the connection. And the point of this particular diagram is to show that feelings and needs are connected. And so if we imagine this image as a wheel, and in the center of that wheel is a hub, and extending from that hub are spokes, then needs are at the center of that wheel. That means they're also at the center of my life. Because those needs will direct how I feel.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm feeling, for example, anxious or angry or hurt or lonely or guarded, then that suggests unmet needs. If, however, I feel proud, inspired, happy, calm, or grateful, that suggests met needs. So that's a beautiful piece of work I can do internally to connect with what am I feeling in this moment? Am I feeling unhappy? Then that's a beautiful feeling, because it tells me immediately I have an unmet need. So the question is, well, what's the need? Yeah. And to explore that rather than to be stuck in this miasm of unhappiness and having no idea why I'm feeling that.
Right. And if we look at feelings is the doorway into finding our needs, and we shut that door of feelings, how can we ever expect our needs to be met, or the needs of our team members to be met?
And we can't. And I'm trying to stop the sharing, and I'm not able to do that in this moment, Lisa.
Okay, well, let me see if I can. All right, the joys of working on Zoom, right? That we have that.
Yes, we have a need for ease, don't we?
We do, absolutely. So how could we, Clarice, understand that? How would feelings and needs, understanding these, improve our workplace culture and our employee engagement? What type of impact would that have on it?
Well, this is an interesting example. A friend of mine was on a project, and there was a timeline, and he noticed one of the team members kept looking at his phone. And he was aware of feeling angry at this team member looking at the phone, like, we got to do this. And so, but he knew this work. He practiced this work. So at the end of the meeting, he approached him and shared what his feelings and needs were and asked him, would you be willing to tell me why it was important for you to look at the phone? And do you know what this man said? He said, I feel ashamed. I think I may be too old for the work. So that kind of honesty and vulnerability opens hearts. And like that, my friend did not feel animosity or anger or frustration. And now he's clear what was alive in someone else. And then together, the two can explore that. Is it true that this man is too old? Then you can see what's really possible or not possible, as the case may be. But isn't that remarkable to have that kind of connection?
Well, and I think that conversation would not have happened if that gentleman had not gone up to say what was, ask about why he was looking at the phone. And the person who was looking at the phone would never have volunteered that.
Right. There was trust between the two of them. Yes. Yeah. And that's interesting. That reminds me, in 2008, there was a Gallup poll that was conducted, and people were asked, well, what are the qualities you want most from your leaders? And it's interesting, there were things like trust, respect, honesty, integrity, stability, hope, and interestingly enough, compassion.
Mm.
Those were the qualities that meant the most to people. And the beauty of this is that this is, as Marshall said, power with, not power over.
Mm-hmm.
So when we can come literally to a meeting, come to the table with the idea of power with rather than power over, then that opens people. And not only that, it increases their engagement, it increases their morale, it increases their retention because their need to be seen, their need to be understood is met. And if that's met, then you're excited to do the work, right? If you understand that what you do is appreciated, because that too is a need, the need to be appreciated. So if I'm going into a meeting and I know that what I contribute is appreciated,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm happy to stay up half the night or whatever it takes to get my part done.
Yes, when you understand the value that you bring to the table, yes, you are more loyal. And that reminds me, Clarice, we were chatting a little bit before we got on. There is a Wall Street Journal article I saw a post of it this week by a gentleman who held it up saying that, and the premise of the article was, bosses today are being more aggressive in the way they speak to their employees. And this gentleman said his thought was look at the philosophy and the approach that the leadership in our country and our government, the way they're speaking to people, they're seeing this filtering down into corporate America. And the thing that was so shocking to me was the number of people in this post supporting the idea that our management should be bullying or speaking in aggressive ways to their employees to get more out of their employees. And I think this supports what you just mentioned, this power over versus, what was the other thing?
Power with.
Power with, yes. Mm-hmm. It's just not the direction I think that is going to produce the best results.
Well, how could it? I mean, if people have the interpretation in their minds that they're being bullied, then how much do they want to do the work? And Marshall, interestingly, said always look for the reasons why someone does something. If they do it because they want to, that's what you want. But if they do it because they think they have to or they ought to, you're going to have a different result. And, sometimes I wonder, this business about sabotage that often occurs on an unconscious level is because people can't get their needs met. And the fact that so many people are so separated from their feelings and needs really speaks to the idea of how much they have been trained and enculturated and educated to stay away from them. But the thing of it is, we're not just our brains. Our brains can think, absolutely, and can think up wonderful ways, but that's not the only piece of information. So feelings and needs are another piece of information. In her book entitled The Empathy Factor, she notes that oftentimes most working environments are about thinking or doing, so it makes it two-dimensional. Mm-hmm. I've got this kind of space, but if we bring in feelings and needs and we make it 3 or 4 dimensions, and we increase our chances for really meeting the needs of our clients, the needs of our customers, and the needs of those people who work, because they count, they matter. And yes, you can kick them out and you can bring in another group, but the same thing is probably going to happen. Who wants to work in an environment where they're bullied? What need is met, by that? And I don't know, it would be lovely for leaders to try something else. And in fact, you may not know this, but Microsoft did this. Microsoft loved this work. And they brought it in, the CEO brought it in, and if I'm remembering correctly, purchased books for all the senior executives. And then 2 or 3 years later, there was an article in a paper that acknowledged the one book, I don't think it was the word book, but the one book that saved the company, and people were very happy. But then, interestingly enough, 3 or 4 years later, there was another article, and at some point, they didn't keep this practice.
Mhm.
And so morale was low again.
Yeah.
So this work isn't something you do on Tuesday, complete on Friday, and then move on to the next thing. This is lifelong work because I'm going to have feelings and needs lifelong. But I do think what also contributes to it is a lot of confusion around needs. Because I think a lot of people sometimes are even afraid to say, I need. And I think the confusion comes between the word need and the word needy. So if I have needs and I'm willing to get them met, then I might say to you, I have a need to be heard, or I have a need to be seen. But if I'm needy, I'm never going to say that to you, but I'm going to expect you to meet that. So I think of it this way. Need is to needy as seed is to seedy. Very similar letters, but very different meanings.
Yeah.
And it's okay to say I need, but a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, I need you to get this in on time. Well, to get it in on time isn't a need, that's a strategy. So maybe the need is support or the need is cooperation. You see, so it's important to keep distinguished feelings from needs and from strategies. Similarly, someone might say, well, I feel that was unfair. Well, that's not a feeling. But if I'm holding the idea that something was unfair, I'll have feelings around that.
True.
So if I don't connect to my feelings and my needs, then I'm stuck. And that's me. That's me keeping me stuck, not someone else, me.
Yeah.
So that's why this work is so empowering.
And, I think too, Clarice, like we elevate the idea of intelligence and being smart and using numbers and data to really make business decisions. But what I know is there are a whole lot of leaders, very visible, very leaders of very successful companies. And I've interviewed people on this podcast that have supported their executive coaching and mentioned that they are leading not necessarily from their head, but they're leading from their heart.
Yes.
And so when I hear heart-centered leadership and leading from your heart and using your gut to make decisions, I hear feelings in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And that's the beauty of this. In her book, The Empathy Factor, she notes that I was looking to see if I could find the page for it, but this man had all this data he was presenting, and it like hurts people's heads. It was so much information, and they're having difficulty keeping up. So she was working with him on this, saying, well, why don't we start first with how you feel about this and your needs. And so he did. He took that risk and he came in and to the actual meeting and he said, you know what? I'm so excited about what it is that I have discovered. I cannot wait to share it with you.
Nice.
And so you can imagine, you can already feel the difference in energy, right? His enthusiasm will certainly touch the enthusiasm in others. And so to be able to start there rather than, well, here's the data and here's XYZ and on page 22 and then, and people are like, oh my goodness, feeling overwhelmed, then it would be lovely, wouldn't it, to have them be present with you as you go through it line by line, engaging their interest and, as you so beautifully said, Lisa, their hearts.
Yes. Yes, I just think like it makes such a difference. So, Clarice, what does it look like when a leader begins to adopt this needs-based communication? What does it look like in a company?
Well, I think it's going to be maybe a little slow and messy to begin with because we're not accustomed to doing this. But if we can keep the larger picture in mind, that what we're going to do is to deepen connection, deepen trust, deepen honesty, deepen authenticity, so that the team can build its own culture. My partner is very fortunate in the corporate work he does, in the area he works in. He has these needs met. They all trust they have each other's backs. And so he loves his work. He's happy to work hard because he loves his work, because he wants to do it, not because he thinks he has to. And so it meets his need for ease and peace. And so I think that's part of it is every day, checking in. What do I feel? What do I need? So that I can literally build that neural pathway. And that's the beautiful thing. Our brains aren't fixed at any given age, whether we're 20 or 120. We can still grow, we can still learn, we can still develop neural pathways. And so to be able to build that neural pathway, if we do that every day for 30 days, then it becomes a habit. And it's no longer unnatural. It's interesting. Some people who come to this work, they're like, that feels so unnatural to say I feel and I need. But then after they do it, they're like, well, it is natural. How could it not be natural? Because we have feelings, we have needs. How is it possible for that to be unnatural? Right. But that does show again how well we have been trained and educated and enculturated to stay as far away as we possibly can. And I feel sadness about that, actually.
Yes. Well, I think maybe we might be seeing some of this change, even though the Wall Street Journal is elevating this. I'm seeing a difference in the way people are parenting now. There is a movement called conscious parenting. And if you even look, there was I can't remember the name of the movie, but there was a Disney movie, I think it was, where it taught children about feelings and to name their feelings, right?
Yes.
And I even see it in my own grandchildren. I've got a preschool grandson, and he'll say, "I feel sad," and I'm not celebrating that he's feeling sad, but I am celebrating that he's feeling sad, right?
And that he can name his feelings, because that's empowering, isn't it? That reminds me, there's a Head Start school in Alaska that had in the classroom a portion called Safe Place. And it was a bench. And behind the bench on the wall were feelings, names of feelings. And it's interesting. I think children may be better adept at naming their feelings than adults because they haven't had the enculturation that we adults have had. So if they can be encouraged to name their feelings and their needs, then imagine what they can do when they become teenagers and young adults and older adults. They're not confused about things. They have clarity, because we all have a need for clarity. We all have a need to know. And that's the beautiful thing about feelings and needs. They're universal. Yeah. It's not like Americans have their own set of feelings and needs, and Europeans and Asians have theirs. So while I may have my need for support met in this moment, if someone else doesn't, I know what that's like because I've had that experience.
Absolutely.
And the other piece too that Marshall believed in, and we haven't touched too much on it, is empathy. And empathy is a very specific way of using feelings and needs. So if someone is upset, most of us are quick. Well, did you read this book, or did you talk to this person, or coming up with some solution? And empathy is very different. It's being curious. Well, what do they feel and what do they need, and guessing it. So if I were to offer you empathy and you have shared what's alive in you, I might guess, well, are you feeling confused? And if you said yes, my guess was great. And if you said no, I'm feeling hurt, my guess was still great, because now you're connected to your feelings. And then we can get curious. So, hurt. So what is the need connected to the feeling of hurt? Do you have a need to belong? Is that it? And then the person can explore then what's alive in them and come up with their own answers. And that's very empowering when someone can find the answers for themselves rather than having the answers given them. But it takes time, because often what happens is like, I've got 30 seconds to speak because someone's going to come in and try to help me. And that's offering the help that isn't really truly helpful. So when I'm given a space to really be alive in the moment with what is alive in me, then that's a very different experience. My partner, I do this with each other. And when he has strong feelings and needs around work issues. We just say, well, I need empathy, and I know what that means. Just be present, because that's what empathy is. And then one time I offered him empathy, and he explored his feelings, he explored his needs. He didn't come up with an answer, but you know what he did realize? He said, I feel so much calmer. He said, that's enough. And then later he found the answer.
Yeah. So, Clarice, I'm thinking, like, as I visualize a workplace, I'm thinking we're walking around with surface level interactions, right? So, what's the cost to a company when leaders do ignore or suppress this emotional expression that it's just natural to us? We are humans, right? We are humans, we're not robots, or at least yet.
Well, some things that come immediately to mind would be lower morale, lower retention, lower productivity, higher drama, higher chaos, higher conflict.
That's not really in any company culture that I want to work for. So I think.
Right. Yes, right. I know. So that's important to remember, that when people, if we were to use this work to manipulate people, the work will not work. It has to be sincere and genuine. But if I realize that my boss really does care about what I'm doing and wants to contribute to my ease and peace in doing it, then I'm happy to stay. I'm happy to do the work I'm doing. I don't want to go because I'm so happy with this environment. And, going back to what you were saying earlier, the Wall Street Journal article and the way people are being encouraged to bully, well, how's that going for everyone? Are we happy? Because it's okay to be happy. Why can't we work and be happy at our work? How did that get to be a foreign idea?
Well, I, that's a really great point, because I even think about my mother's generation. My mother's still with us. Work was a 4-letter word. It was not something to be enjoyed. It was something you only gave so much in exchange for the energy of money, that energetic exchange, right? But then we came into a point where we found out that we brought a value to our work. We brought the skill to our work. And I think that's when things started to change. But I think, Clarice, too, when we look at company cultures, businesses don't exist because it's a social club, right? Businesses exist to provide a product or service in exchange for money, or exchange for, the profits that we're looking for. So when we look at companies that are focused on performance, how do we reframe needs as data instead of as emotionally indulging people? That need is data we could use.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because not only do people have needs, but businesses have needs.
Okay.
Well, right. They have a need for purpose. They have a need for meaning, ostensibly, perhaps a need to contribute to the well-being of others. And so if we can think of it that way, that the business culture has its own needs, then be curious of what are the needs of this particular business. And think needs first, strategy second, because that's how Marshall saw that. Often when we put strategies first, needs second, it's like putting the cart in front of the horse, and it makes it difficult for the horse to move. But if I can put needs first, then strategies, it's like taking the cart and putting it behind the horse. And so it's easier for the horse to move. Years and years ago, I worked as a reporter for a daily newspaper. And in those years, they had printing presses, so we didn't have computers. And there was some trouble going on in the printing press. And so the owner of the business was curious, and he went to see, he had a need to know. So he went to the printing press and he talked to people. And you know what? They said, well, these chairs are uncomfortable. He sat down in the chair and he said, you know what? They are. The next day, they all had new chairs. Now, imagine working for a company like that, where the boss is not way up here, separated from the employees, but the boss is present to the needs of his employees and willing to get those needs met.
Yeah.
That would be a beautiful business culture, wouldn't it?
It would be. It would be. And again, they feel seen, heard, and understood, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That reminds me of, I'm assuming this is true. You may know more about this than I do. I had a friend who worked for IBM, and the story at IBM was this, that Mr. Watson, who had started the business during the Depression, had told his employees, I won't be able to give you a raise, but you will keep your jobs no matter what. Now, imagine hearing that as an employee in the Depression, when people right and left are losing their jobs. And in some ways, while we're not particularly in an economic depression, we might be in this country an emotional depression because of some of the changes that are happening. Imagine being told you will keep your job. And what's interesting to me is, to this day, he's still called Mr. Watson. They had so much respect for him that they would never imagine calling him his first and last name. It is Mr. Watson.
Yeah.
So it is possible. That's my point. It is possible to build a culture. And they do this in some of the Scandinavian countries already, where individuals, workers, have the opportunity to share what's alive in them. They can get their need met to contribute and to be heard. So wouldn't that be something?
Yeah, even that story, like I had chills as you were speaking of the thought during the depression, knowing I would be able to keep my job when everyone around me, that was not necessarily the case. That would be amazing. Clarice, when we talk about feelings, you're going to start seeing people get uncomfortable. And it's what, you and I both called, it's the F word, right? Like it's the F word that people want to run from. And we see this particularly, and I don't mean to, this is just what I see, and very generalized. And I've spoken with people, interviewed people on this podcast, and even people who run businesses around this. But what we see a lot of times is male leaders feel like, here I'm using the word feeling, and
Wow, that was great work you just did, Lisa. Great catch.
But they experience this feeling of loss of authority. They think they're going to lose authority if they embrace this approach of talking about feelings. But if you think about feelings as the filter on top of needs, how can male leaders benefit from embracing this without thinking that they are losing their authority? How would you answer that?
Well, it's interesting because I wonder, as you said that aloud, I found myself wondering, how much do they enjoy their work if it's always about authority? Because their band of experience is so narrow. And to be able to express feelings and to bring it up. But it's interesting that the F word, that does seem to be that feelings is the new F word. I agree with that. But a lot of times too, businesses will say, oh, that's so soft, or that's so nice. But what is soft, about effecting change and creating connection among employees? How is that soft? Wouldn't you want that? I mean, I wonder how many times do errors occur because there wasn't clarity, because there wasn't clear communication, because there wasn't connection, because no one said anything. And that's not to say that we can't learn from our errors. Of course we can, but how often is it that if we don't express our feelings and needs around a particular project, we just go ahead and do it, kind of eyes closed, fingers crossed, I hope this works. And then realize, well, a little bit it does, but we're going to have to go back and do X, Y, and Z. So why not feel curious? I mean, that's one of my favorite phrases, and it names the word feeling, and the need is I am curious to know. Because curious is a feeling, to know is a need. So I'm curious to know, how is this project going?
I use that one
Have
quite
any?
often.
Yeah, isn't that lovely because it's so invitational?
Hmm.
It's not saying, well, what's going on here? Why isn't it done? It's just,
Hmm.
I'm curious to know, how may I support you in that? I
Hmm.
mean, that's a beautiful way to express it. What is it that you need?
Yeah, that's really good.
And invite people to really think about that. And the beautiful thing is there are lists of feelings and there are lists of needs that can be found on the Center for Nonviolent Communication. And it's interesting, Marshall's way of defining nonviolence was based on Mahatma Gandhi's definition that nonviolence is who and what we really are when
Hmm.
violence has subsided from our hearts. So it's possible this whole authority issue that you were bringing up and pushing it could have a kind of violence to it because Marshall defined violence as that communication that alienates,
Hmm.
it hurts, it brings pain. That's what it is. And he called it life alienating language because it alienates us from the best in ourselves. So if I'm with a boss who's, you got to work faster, you got to work harder, that is going to be experienced by me as very alienating. And
So,
go ahead.
yeah, I'm sorry. So sorry. I don't want to go too much further. I want to go back and capture what you said again, that we are naturally non-violent, but that express, would you say that again? I don't
Yes.
want to lose that.
Yes. So the way Marshall defined nonviolence was based on Mahatma Gandhi's definition, which is that nonviolence is our natural state when violence has subsided from our hearts. And another
Mm.
way to say this, and Marshall really believed this, is that we are essentially compassionate beings, every single one of us. And he really believed that. That was his basic premise. And what was interesting to him, the two questions he asked, one, well, what is it that helps people stay connected to the best of themselves, which is their compassion in difficult circumstances? And what is it that helps them disconnect? And he realized it was language.
Mm-hmm.
The words I think and the words I speak are going to determine if I stay connected to the best in me. And so that's really remarkable. People who hit, who scream, who curse are demonstrating what Marshall would say tragic examples of an unmet need.
Mm-hmm.
Tragic because it is so hard to be present to someone's need when they're hitting or screaming or yelling.
Yes,
But if you
all of that.
think about it, maybe the yelling is because they have a need to be heard. Maybe the hitting is the need to be seen. Their strategy doesn't contribute to the well-being of everyone. So we,
Mm-hmm.
see if we can find a better strategy that contributes to everyone. But rather than make them wrong or bad or evil or whatever the vocabulary is, to see instead that they're attempting to meet a need.
Mm.
And that's part of Marshall's work to help us move beyond right or wrong into feelings and needs. And that reminds me of this lovely line by the Persian poet Rumi, who said, beyond right and wrong, there is a field, meet me there. And I see this work as that field. So I
Mm.
don't have to make an employee wrong or bad. Get curious, well, what's the need?
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful quote by Rumi. Love that. Clarice, what advice do you have for companies or leaders who want to start integrating this, but we're really not sure how? Where would we start?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I offer workshops and practice groups. And to make perfectly clear, I do not charge it. I do this for joy.
Okay.
And so it is my joy to offer this, but to have the opportunity to be introduced to Marshall's basic ideas and to explore them. And then often some people who are in the workshop are like, well, where do we go from now? And
Mhm.
that's why I offer the practice groups. so that we give ourselves the opportunity to practice. So the workshop introduces the basic ideas, but in the practice, we may do role plays, we may offer empathy. If we're anticipating a challenging conversation, we're going to give ourselves permission to be as messy as we can possibly be, and then see, well, what parts of this language do I feel strong? What would I do again? And then when they go into the actual conversation, they've had experience with it and can go in more confident and more empowered.
Yeah, it's natural. You don't have to think so much because you've practiced it before.
And not only that, but you practicing with others who have the shared interests. So there's a connection, there's a safety, there's a support there. You're not like on your own here.
Right, right. So, Clarice, if people want to know how to reach you, what's the best way to contact you?
Well, thank you, Lisa. I have a website called atlantacompassion.com. And on that website, you'll see my name. And if you click on that, you'll see the website, my email address. I also, by the way, have one for Marshall. And there's a wonderful 2-minute and 47-second video of him. That is my favorite. If people are curious, well, who is this Marshall person?
Yes, we've heard his name quite often today. I am curious to go learn a little bit more about him. Well, Clarice, thank you so much for being with us today. I think this is a conversation whose time has come, most definitely, if you look at what is going on in the world and going on in our workplaces where we're all trying to do the best we can. But again, I think it's this conditioning that has brought us to the place where it's been difficult. So I love this idea.
Well, and thank you, Lisa. I so appreciate your willingness and your interest in giving this time and attention. Clearly, I love the work. I'm completely in. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. So Clarice Belcher reminds us that every workplace is made up of human beings with human needs. When we can name what's underneath the surface, we don't just connect more deeply. We lead more powerfully. And if you're a leader looking to build a culture of trust, retention, and real engagement, I encourage you to work or look into Clarice's workshops or bring her into your organization. And don't worry, we're going to put all the links in the show notes of the books that she referenced and also of her website, atlantacompassion.com. Because when we build from a place of compassion, everyone wins. Thank you for listening today. And this is a reminder to go chase your passion. You can see how this has contributed and influenced Clarice's life work. It's going to lead to your purpose and will help you build that personal brand of integrity. Living in who you are is expressing yourself authentically. And it's the key that unlocks everything on the path to becoming your legendary self. We'll see you here next week.